Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm honored to make this welcome to you. Thank you for being here this evening. I'm president of Austin Graduate School of Theology. We are honored to partner with First Things in providing this lecture, the second year that we have done that. On the back of your program, there's a little bit of information about our school and our mission. This fits very well with our mission at Austin Grad. I want to say thanks to the University Avenue Church of Christ for opening their building to us this evening and making this available. Their minister, senior minister Eddie Sharp, is going to lead us in prayer. After Eddie leads us in prayer, Professor Keith Stanglin from Austin Grad will be introducing our speaker, and then he will moderate the question and answer session later in the evening. Eddie?
Let's pray. Our Lord and Father, we're thankful tonight for your presence with us. We're thankful for this gathering of men and women who all share a common confession that Jesus is Lord. Tonight, as we hear this message from our brother Peter Leithart, that you would bless him and you would bless us through him. Father, we would pray that what we share tonight will make us not only better scholars, but better servants. We pray this in the name of your Son. Amen.
I want to join Stan Reed in welcoming you all here tonight for this Austin Graduate School of Theology First Things lecture. As Stan said, this is our second year in a row to cooperate in this way with First Things. There's much that recommends this partnership between our school and First Things. As a faculty, we at Austin Grad have sometimes referred to ourselves as critically orthodox. We also are part of a Christian movement whose goal was to restore the unity of the church. So as such, we have an affinity for much of what happens at First Things and much of what they produce in print and online. So one purpose of our mutual collaboration is simply introductory and informative. That is, there may be those among Austin Grad's friends who don't know about First Things. And there may be those among First Things readers who don't know about Austin Grad. But there should be more of us who know about both now than there were this time last year, I hope. But I'm sure there are still some of us here tonight who are not acquainted with either Austin Grad or with First Things. And so this is a further step in remedying that. The more obvious purpose, of course, for this partnership is this gathering and the privilege to hear from our esteemed speaker, whom I will now introduce. Dr. Peter Leithart is the president of the Theopolis Institute, which is a leadership training program in Birmingham, Alabama. And he will tell us a bit more about this in a moment. And he is doctor at the Trinity Presbyterian Church there. He and his wife have 10 children and 7 grandchildren. And it's also important to note in this setting tonight that he is a member of the advisory council and that he has his own blog at firstthings.com. And I don't know of anybody else who has their own blog at firstthings.com. He posts frequently on there, even I've seen sometimes multiple times a day on that blog. In addition to indefatigable blogging, he is one of the most prolific authors in theology, authors of books in theology that I know of. Just this year, he has published Delivered from the Elements of the World with IVP Academic, and I think forthcoming next month is a book with Brazos Press called The End of Protestantism. Other books that I have found helpful and useful and can highly recommend are Defending Constantine from IVP, Traces of the Trinity, which we have here tonight, I'll talk more about later, from Brazos Press, and especially I've enjoyed his book called Deep Exegesis from Baylor. So we're very grateful to have Dr. Leithart with us tonight. We look forward to his lecture now on Reformational Catholicism. Please join me in welcoming Peter Leithart.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Austin Graduate School of Theology and to First Things Magazine for making this event possible. Thanks also to the University Avenue Church of Christ for hosting it in this beautiful facility. It's really a treat to be here and to share this evening with you. I do want to make one correction in the introduction. When you have 10 children, the number of grandchildren is always a moving target. When you have 10 grown children, I should say, and 7 grandchildren that have been born, now have 2 on the way within the next 6 months. So we're very grateful for the Lord's blessing on our family. I want to say a few things about the Theopolis Institute. The Theopolis Institute, as Keith mentioned, is a pastoral leadership training program. We're based in Birmingham, Alabama, and we offer graduate level courses primarily in biblical studies and worship, liturgical studies. And we've been doing that in a format of intensive courses several times a year for the past 3 years. We're in the beginning of our 4th season of those intensive courses. We're hoping to start a year-long program in the fall of 2017, and I have brochures that describe the program that'll be on the book table if you want to pick one up and learn more about the program that we're launching next fall. This will be a year-long program for college graduates. It'll be an intensive course focusing on biblical studies and liturgical studies with some ministry experience that's built into the program and also some cultural study that's built into the program. If you are interested in the program, or if you know somebody who might be, please pick up a brochure and pass it on. We also publish a monthly e-newsletter called In Medias Res, and have a sign-up sheet for that newsletter. If you're interested in learning about Theopolis, keeping up with our various activities, receiving monthly emails that include articles from our website on different topics, please put your name and your email address on the sign-up sheet. Keith will start that over on this side of the church. When it gets to the back, if you could send it to the other side and circulate around to the front again, I'd appreciate that. My title is Reformational Catholicism, and this talk is based on and related to a book that's coming out in the next month, coming out later in October, called The End of Protestantism. And the title is intended to play on 2 meanings of the word end. When you come to the end of something, it means that something ceases. You come to the end of the ball game. That means the buzzer sounds and the game is over. The last inning is pitched and you're done with the baseball game. But end also means purpose or goal, and I'm attempting in the book to describe the original purpose of the Reformation and try to revive that original purpose, which I understand to be the purpose of trying to reform the Church Catholic. The effort of the early reformers was not to break away and form a separate church. The original vision was to try to reform the entire church. And that's a vision that has somewhat been lost among Protestants, and my book is a plea to recover that original vision of the end of Protestantism, the purpose of Protestantism, attempting to reform the entire church according to the Word of God. And in reaching that end or purpose, Protestantism would cease to be. It would cease to be a separate set of churches, a separate variation of Christianity. If in fact the Church Catholic were reformed according to the Word of God, then there would be no need for that separate church. So the book is also a plea for unity. It's a plea for unity among Protestant groups that have been split since the Reformation and after, It's a plea for efforts to reunite Protestants and Catholics. It's a plea for Protestants to recognize and to take advantage of and to receive the riches that are on offer in the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox traditions. And it's also a plea for Catholics, though to a lesser degree, a plea for Catholics to learn something from the Protestants. When I presented this to my Lutheran brother recently, he responded with a series of criticisms. He's an attorney, and so we got into an argument about the topic of my book. And his criticisms reduced to basically three. Being a Lutheran, he said, Lutherans are not going to go for this. Lutherans are not going to accept any program of unity that involves people being at the Lord's table holding different views about the real presence. Lutherans aren't going to go for it. Besides, this is a utopian vision. It's never going to happen. The church is never going to be united. The church is never going to function as one body this side of the eschaton. And then his other objection was, I have more important things to attend to. We as a culture have more important things to attend to. There's a lot of bad things going on, and those take priority over trying to be chummy with my Methodist neighbors or with the Presbyterians or with Roman Catholics. I want to come at the topic of my book by trying to address the latter two of those objections tonight. The first objections, Lutherans won't go for it. I'll concede to my brother, and I'll concede that Lutherans are hopeless. For any Lutherans out there, I'm of course joking. Some of my longest acquaintances and friends are Lutherans, like my brother, like my 95-year-old father. But I do want to address the other two issues in reverse order. I want to ask the question, is this something that should be a high priority for Christians in an age like our own, which is full of all kinds of evils that we can attend to and that we need to address? And then later in the talk, I want to address the second objection that my brother brought up, which is the objection that this is a utopian vision. It's never going to happen. We can't really expect this to occur. We can't expect churches to function together as unified congregations in a unified worldwide body, fellowship and communion of churches. My brother has a point, of course. There are great evils around us, and if we just confine ourselves to the United States of America, all of us can come up with a laundry list of things that need serious attention. There's violence and poverty in our inner cities. There are racial tensions, and even trying to assess the nature of those racial tensions and the intensity of those racial tensions is a difficult question. There's been the tragic comic disarray of this presidential season. We face aggressive secularism that takes the form of an aggressive relativism that's become institutionalized in our legal system and in other institutions of our society, that's begun to question and undermine basic institutions of society like the family, and what seem to be basic and obvious natural distinctions like the one between male and female. We face the threat of Islamic terrorism abroad and the danger of terrorism at home. We face mounting debt, and we have the constant bloodshed of legalized abortion. And in that context, and you could come up with a dozen other things that need our attention, need our prayers, need our faithful activity and faithful witness. In that context, it doesn't seem like unifying the church, pursuing unity in the church should have a very high priority. It doesn't seem like that should be on the front burner of a pastor's agenda or a church's agenda or an individual Christian's agenda. I think that's a superficial assessment of things. And I think if we had time, it was suggested that there's biblical precedent for having a talk go until midnight. I won't do that. But if we had that much time, we could probably trace connections between the disunity and divisions of the church and many of the pathologies that we face as a culture. Brad Gregory, a Notre Dame historian, wrote a recent book called The Unintended Reformation, in which he describes the effects of the fragmentation of the church that took place after the Reformation. And one of the effects was an undermining of our confidence in truth. When you have Protestants saying, this is true, and Catholics saying different things that they believe are absolutely true, and even the Protestants don't agree on what's absolutely true, there seems to be no way to negotiate those differences. There's no overarching authority that resolves those differences and leaves people with the impression that these are just a series of opinions, and series of opinions that we can't really negotiate or adjudicate. We can't really determine what is true. So Gregory thinks that relativism is actually related to the disunity of the church, that the roots of modern relativism go back to the post-Reformation divisions. I think we could trace connections like that between our various cultural pathologies and the divisions that we have in the church since the Reformation at least, and really prior to the Reformation as well. We don't have until midnight, so I want to focus in on one particular issue that I think is related to this issue of church division, and that is the issue of religious liberty. Some will dismiss the supposed threats to religious liberty as Christians reflecting or manifesting a persecution complex or manifesting some kind of martyr complex. I think the threats are real. There are real threats to Christians who are trying to go into certain kinds of professions. You may have seen reports about the American Bar Association trying to enforce certain views on its members, certain views of gender equality and gay marriage, not only in their professional work, but even in their private expressions of opinion. We have the threat to religious liberty among colleges in California in a recent state bill in California. We have businesses that are under threat of various sorts because they won't comply with the new sexual regime. There are real threats to religious liberty, but what I want to suggest is that those threats to religious liberty are not entirely an aberration from our founding principles as a liberal democratic order, but that those threats to religious liberty are actually inherent in the liberal system that we have as Americans. And I should pause to define what I mean by liberal order or the liberal state. When I use the word liberal this evening, I'm not using liberal in the sense of being opposite of conservative. I'm not using liberal to describe the views of the Democratic Party or of certain Democratic candidates. I'm using liberal in a broader political theory sense to describe the order, the political order that characterizes many of the many modern European and North American democracies. It's a system that arose in the aftermath of the wars of religion. It's a system that arose in the early centuries of the modern era, and that is characterized by separation of powers, usually by some form of democratic election, by representative government of some sort, and particularly by the separation of church and state. Some form of separation of church and state is characteristic of most liberal systems. For me to say that liberal systems and liberal states have an inherent tendency to inhibit religious freedom seems counterintuitive. It seems just blatantly wrong, because liberal systems were arguably, by their own account, set up precisely to protect free expression in speech and free expression of religion. It's a common storyline to tell the rise of modern polities this way. After the Reformation, we have wars of religion going on. Protestants are at war with Catholics and Catholics with Protestants, and sometimes Protestants at war with each other over issues like transubstantiation and other detailed theological questions. And the question that liberal order is intended to answer is, how can we live together as in a political system when people hold different views of things that they think are exceedingly important, different theological views on issues like transubstantiation or justification by faith or the papacy? How can Catholics and Protestants and different kinds of Protestants live together in peace without killing each other over the doctrine of transubstantiation. And according to this story, the answer is that the state determines that it's not going to take a stand on any of those theological issues. The state ceases to be a theological player and claims to retreat to the position of referee. The state is there not to determine who's right and who's wrong in these debates, or to take a position in these debates, to promote one church as opposed to another. The state's role, rather, is to protect a free playing ground, a free ground for play and debate, and to make sure that everybody has their capacity, that everybody has their freedom to present their own views. The state is limited to common concerns, to secular concerns. It limits it to strictly political concerns. It doesn't get involved in theological or religious concerns. It doesn't try to establish any particular form of theology. But that's really not possible. It's not really possible for any state to be theologically neutral. And it's not possible for the liberal state to do what it claims to do, which is to limit itself to only those issues that are secular and common to everyone, and not to make any kind of claims or take any kinds of positions on disputed theological matters. In the following several minutes, I'm depending on the work of a couple of Roman Catholic scholars, a father and son team, David L. Schindler and D.C. David C. Schindler, who've written on this topic at great length in various places. The liberal state claims to be incompetent in deciding theological questions. It claims to be incompetent to decide matters of absolute truth. And so it draws a boundary between matters of absolute truth, religious matters, theological matters, and political matters, things that it attends to on its own. It circumscribes, it draws a boundary that limit its area of competence, and it limits itself to those things that are of common public concern. But that's not as innocent as it appears. Just in the nature of the case, in order to draw a boundary, you have to make some kind of judgments, not only about what's on your side of the boundary, but also about what's on the other side of the boundary. If we're going to build a wall between Texas and Mexico, we need to know not only something about where Texas is, but we need to be able to see over that boundary into Mexico. We can't draw a line, we can't draw a boundary without making some judgments about what's on the other side of the boundary. A state that claims to limit itself to common secular concerns has to be able to distinguish between the sacred and the secular, between the religious and the political. It has to claim at least that competence, enough competence to recognize religion when it sees it, so that it can make sure that religion stays outside of its area of competence and only certain things are brought in. Well, how can a liberal system make this decision? How does it decide what counts as religion, what counts as sacred, what counts as theological, and what doesn't? It can't appeal to some theological tradition. If you're setting up a liberal order, you can't go to the Vatican and say, ask the Pope to determine what counts as religion, what counts as sacred, and what doesn't, because that would subordinate religious order to a theological system, which is precisely what liberal order is trying to avoid. Liberal order is claiming not to be subordinate to any theological system, not to promote any theological system. And so it can't make the decision about what counts as religion and what doesn't based on some theological system. It has to do it from its own resources. It has to make those determinations from its own, from itself. It has to decide from within its vision of what counts as politics and what counts as religion. It has to have its own competence to make those decisions. Even while claiming to be a referee that's just trying to keep a free playing field, the state actually has to decide what religion is. In other words, it not only functions as a referee on the playing field, but it determines where the playing field begins and ends. It can only function as a referee if it itself decides what the playing field is. And that means that the liberal state always is making theological statements, whether implied or overt. And we can just think about some fairly obvious places where this is the case. A liberal system, in the way I've described how liberal systems came to be, a liberal system has to know that transubstantiation is a private theological opinion and not something that is of important public concern. It has to know that transubstantiation is on the religious side of that boundary. I'm not sure that all Catholics, in fact, I suspect that most Catholics would disagree with that. Their doctrine of transubstantiation has some impact on how we understand our common life, our political life. We can't really separate supernatural and natural as neatly as the liberal state claims to, and to make that separation is to make a theological judgment. Or we can think of the anthropology, the view of human beings, and the view of human good that's inherent in a liberal order. Liberal order institutionalizes a particular anthropology, and it focuses on human beings as free, choosing beings. Will defines what human beings are. And the liberal state exists to maintain that freedom, to maintain that free exercise of will. It's assuming and imposing a certain anthropology, Christian anthropology, but certainly isn't identical to it. It can't be, by definition, it ought not be identical to a Christian anthropology, because the liberal state is supposed to be theologically neutral. It can't adopt a Christian anthropology as its basis for law or politics. Somehow the liberal state knows that the act of faith is a private act, a private choice that individuals make. But again, many Christians would disagree with that. Many Christians would see an act of faith as having communal dimensions. You make a profession of faith as you enter into a congregation of the Church of Christ. And there's a communal dimension to that profession of faith. You're making a profession of faith in the midst of a congregation, and you're entering into the common confession that the church makes. You can't reduce an act of faith to simply an individual choice. But that's what liberal order assumes: free and private choice and individual choice. Liberal order has its own ecclesiology, its own understanding of what the church is, or at least its own bias towards certain kinds of churches and against other kinds of churches. The churches that are free churches that think of themselves as voluntary associations, churches that have a more sacramental view of their existence, churches that don't think of themselves as voluntary societies, don't really fit with liberal order. Their claims about human beings don't really fit with liberal order. The churches that fit best with a liberal system are churches that are able to make the same kind of separation between natural and supernatural, between the political and the religious, that the liberal state makes. But there are many forms of Christianity that contest that very distinction and say that you can't really have natural life that is purely and exclusively natural, that even natural life is always already a life of grace because it's always already a gift from a living God. You can't separate temporal and eternal concerns. You can't separate heaven and earth as neatly as the liberal state claims it does. And churches that do make that separation or work very well within a liberal system, churches that don't make that separation find themselves constrained. And they find that they have to act like voluntary associations. Every church becomes a denomination in America. Even churches that are state churches in Europe come over and they become just another denomination. The Roman Catholic Church becomes just another American denomination. It can't press the claims that the Roman Catholic Church has made in Europe, here in the States, because the liberal state doesn't permit it. Now, that kind of argument might seem like sour grapes. You know, the ref is not on our side. We want the ref on our side. If we want him biased, but we want him biased in our direction. He used to be biased in our direction way back when. American law and American politics was tilted in a Protestant direction, and when that was the case, all Protestants were pretty happy with it. Now it's tilted the other direction, and we're not happy with it. But I think it's not just sour grapes, and it's not just a reaction to recent developments. There's what the Schindlers describe as a tyranny within liberal order itself. And the simplest way to make that point is to make this point, to develop it this way. A liberal state cannot, by definition, subject itself or be accountable to any theological or metaphysical order that transcends it. It cannot do that by definition. It may do that in practice. The American system functioned essentially as a Protestant republic for the first couple of centuries of our existence, not because it had established Protestantism as a state church in any way, but because the majority of people were Protestants, and that's the way America functioned. But it can't subject itself to any theological or metaphysical system. If it did so, then it would cease to be a liberal order. But that means that the liberal system itself becomes the ultimate framework within which all public concerns are judged. The ultimate physical claims and moral claims are judged. And liberal order becomes the standard by which they are judged. If a theological opinion or a stance by a church as liberal order understands it, then it's acceptable. It's to be promoted. If it runs afoul of those assumptions, then it's inhibited. We can see this in the past 70 years in racial issues in the United States. Churches that insisted on racial segregation and colleges that insisted on racial segregation ran afoul of the liberal state. That's not acceptable, even though it's a theological opinion. It's not an acceptable theological opinion anymore. I'm not defending segregation. I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I'm just trying to explain the dynamics of what's going on. The liberal state doesn't permit that kind of theological opinion to have public weight, and you'll have to pay a price if you're going to try to set up a college on the basis of racial segregation. What's happening today, of course, is that the same kind of dynamics are at work with regard to sexual issues. Sexual orientation, gay marriage, transgender rights, and all the related issues have become the wedge, and it's becoming increasingly the case that, or at least there's an increasing threat that if you have an institution, a church or a college or a school that takes a stand that runs afoul of the liberal understanding of freedom, the liberal understanding of free choice, which is the free choice to become a man or woman at will, if you run afoul of that, then you're no longer compatible with liberal order and you have to pay the price. You lose your tax exemption, or at least you're culturally marginalized. So religious freedom, for those reasons, the threats to religious freedom that we're facing today are not simply an aberration or the result of some kind of collapse of our freedoms. They are that in certain ways. But they're also impulses within liberal order itself that tend toward the totalitarianism of liberal views of freedom and liberal views of human existence. And this is where my critique of denominationalism comes back in. Here, I'm still have my brother in mind. I haven't presented this argument to him, but I still have my brother's complaint in mind. Is it important that we try to overcome the denominational system and try to reunify the church, where the church is actually functioning more fully as a unified body? Denominationalism in the United States is the established church form of American Christianity. In comparison with the churches of Europe, historic churches of Europe, America has a disestablished church. No pastor in the United States receives tax money anymore. Some, at one point, they did early on in our history, but pastors no longer receive tax monies to support them. Churches don't get some kind of preference because they're a certain kind of church. You don't have establishments at the state level or at the national level. In that sense, we're a disestablished church. We have disestablished churches. In another sense, denominationalism is the established church form of America. It's the only form that is compatible with liberal order, because there cannot be an establishment of any particular theological or metaphysical view. There can't be an establishment of any particular church. All the churches are put on a level playing field, competing with each other, and are all reduced to private associations with some kind of public voice, but essentially private associations. Will Herbert, the great sociologist of the middle of the 20th century, put it this way. He said that denominationalism is itself secularization. And by secularization, he meant a distinction between what he called conventional and operational religion. Conventional religion is the kind of religion that adherents practice. So Christians practice Christianity, believe the tenets of Christianity. That's a conventional religion. Islam is a conventional religion. Hinduism is a conventional religion. But societies also have operational religions that form an overarching canopy of belief and plausibility, a canopy that unifies the whole society. That's the operational religion. And Herbert points out that in America, that there's always and necessarily that difference. The conventional religion is not the operational religion. The operational religion is, according to Herbert, a commitment to the American way of life. That's what unites us as American Christians. We're not united by confession or creed. We're not united by any kind of denominational structures. We're not united by a common table in some cases. We're not united by communion and fellowship across denominational boundaries. What unites us all as Americans is a common commitment to the American way of life. Liberal order is denominational, and that means what unites us is our common commitment to denominational structures. What unites us is our common commitment to maintain our divisions, you could say, if you want it to put it provocatively. Here I think is where the critique of denominationalism runs into the threats to religious liberty. Here's the reasoning. Liberalism itself has this impulse toward totalizing, toward inhibiting and infringing on religious freedom. Denominationalism is an aspect, a central aspect, one of the pillars of liberal order. Insofar as we're supporting a denominational church, we are supporting the very structures, the liberal structures that I've tried to describe, that inhibit and impinge on our freedom, that impinge on our free exercise of religion. If we don't want a liberal order that's totalizing, that is an ultimate framework, then that liberal order has to be accountable to something beyond itself. It has to be accountable to God or to some higher purpose. Liberal order as it stands today is committed only to itself, and we're supporting that totalizing ultimate form of liberal order insofar as we are supporting denominationalism. If we want to really make a fundamental strike in favor of religious liberty, I submit, we have to be at work to try to undermine and overcome the denominational system that characterizes American Christianity. What about my brother's other objection, that it's a utopian vision? It's never going to happen. Churches are never going to be unified. I think that's an expression not of hearty realism about the world, but instead an expression of a lack of in the gospel itself. I haven't presented that argument to my brother either. God is a living God. He's an active God. He's the creator. And he not only makes worlds, he made the world, but he makes worlds, and he unmakes worlds, and he remakes worlds. Even in the creation account in Genesis 1, we see God doing it. And then on day 2, he changes it. Takes the water from below the firmament, the waters below, puts them above, and sticks a firmament in between. It's a new world at the end of day 2. And then day 3 comes along, and God changes it again. The water is torn into, and dry land emerges, and plants begin to grow out of that dry land. At the end of day 3, it's not the same world. God takes hold of the world each day of the creation week, and he breaks it down so that he can put it together in a new way. And throughout the history that we have in the Bible, God is doing that in the history of his people. God sets up Israel with a tabernacle in the wilderness under the Mosaic order, but eventually that phrase, because of human sin, it comes under judgment. The tabernacle is torn in pieces. It's never put back together again. But then God calls David and then Solomon, and the tabernacle doesn't reappear, but it's incorporated into something else. It's incorporated into the temple. And then that comes apart. That world that's centered on the Solomonic temple comes about because of the sins of Israel. And Israel is deprived of the land and kingdom. God tears Israel apart. Israel, Judah, essentially ceases to be. Everything that identified them as Israel, apart from the faithfulness of God, ceases to be. Any visible markers of Judah just disappear. They don't have a land, they don't have a king, they don't have a temple. They still can maintain the practices of Torah. They're still circumcised, and they have the faithfulness of God, but they are in the grave of exile. And then God raises them up again. And each time God does this with Israel, he gives them a new name. They're Hebrews coming out of Egypt. They're sons of Israel when they come into the land. They're Israel and Judah when they're divided. Then when they come back from exile, there's no Israel and Judah anymore. They're no longer divided. They're just all Jews. That's the God we serve and worship. That's the God who is still active in the world. That's the God who has continued to make and unmake and remake worlds since the cross and resurrection of Jesus. And we can't assume that the world that presently exists, the configuration of churches that presently exist, is the last word. We can't assume that names that we now bear, Church of Christ, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, Catholic, are the names that we're going to bear forever. To say that would be to say God is dead. He's stopped working. He's no longer the God who's making and unmaking worlds. But how do we know that God's intention in all this is to bring unity to the church, unity to humanity? I think that is inherent in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Abraham, aftermath of the Tower of Babel. The nations are scattered. They're divided by language, they're divided by worship, divided by confession, and God calls Abraham so that he can be an instrument to bring blessing to the nations that have been divided by Babel. He's going to bring blessing to those nations through Abraham's seed. And the nations which were scattered at Babel are going to be reunited, at least to this extent, that they all become recipients of the blessing of Abraham. In the New Testament, that amounts to the blessing of the Spirit, the gift of the Spirit that comes at Pentecost. That promise to Abraham that he's going to be a blessing to the nations, that the nations that are split and separated at Babel are going to be reunited under the blessing of God, that's the promise that Jesus came to fulfill. Jesus came to redeem us from our sins, not by any works that we've done, but by his grace. He also came to break down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile, and to call to create a new humanity made up of all nations and peoples and tribes and tongues. That's the gospel. The gospel is about Jesus Christ rescuing individuals from sin and hell. The gospel is equally about Jesus Christ dying and rising again to reunite the human race. This is what God is about in the course of human history. It's not utopian to hope for and work for the reunion of the churches. It's an expression of confidence in the God of the gospel. It's an expression of confidence in God's promises, the God of Abraham, who's bringing the blessings of God to the nations. I do have some comments on how to go about doing some of that practically, but I want to pause there and begin to take questions. If you want to get into some of the practical concerns that I talk about in the book, we can get into that in the question and answer session. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, we do have a few minutes for questions, so if you'll raise your hand, I will bring the mic to you. Can you hear me from this? Okay. I'll bring the mic to you, and if you would stand and state your name, please.
Hey, my name's Christian Davis. I was wondering what you thought about the fact that I think if it's either all but one or all of our Supreme Court justices are Catholic, I was wondering what you think that has to do with how they interpret the law inside of the liberal order you're describing.
Yeah, there are an awful lot of Catholics on the Supreme Court, and I'm not sure what the numbers are. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think that what we have in some cases, I think of the late Antonin Scalia, who I think operated fairly consciously as a Catholic jurist, not that he was trying to oppose Catholicism in the United States, but that he was attentive to Catholic thought while he was making his decisions as a Supreme Court justice. I think others on the court others on the court, I think I'd say they were accommodated to liberal order and have adjusted their Catholic convictions to fit the constraints of liberal order. I think of, maybe the most more immediate examples in my mind would be various Catholic politicians who are pro-choice in spite of clear teaching from the Catholic Church. This is a private opinion. My religious opinions, my moral opinions are private opinions, and the only thing that's of public concern is what the liberal order says is a public concern, which is that abortion is the law of the land. So that's an example again of a Catholic accommodation to liberalism.
Hi, Micah Valine. It seems to me are differentiated from each other in some way, or they wouldn't exist separately.
Yeah.
And so for what you described to occur, there would need to either be some new consensus at the middle, a new friendlier relativism that privileges a common ground, or the victory of one of those traditions, at least on the face of it. So I wonder if you would comment a little bit on the detail.
Right. Well, I could say, I suppose, that, one side's going to win, it's going to be our side. My practical, the thrust of my practical suggestions in the book, I think that I wanted to give suggestions that are achievable for ordinary pastors, ordinary Christians, not people who are operating at some rarefied international ecumenical level. I think that's where the action is at the local level, where churches can engage one another, where pastors can engage one another, where pastors and churches can pray together for greater unity. On the doctrinal issue, I think one of the ill effects, I think, of the denominational system is that it permits us to live with an appearance of harmony and peace without addressing the issues that divide us. We don't really have to resolve the question of infant baptism because we each have our own churches that we can go to, and we don't really have to confront people in our own communions that hold differing opinions. So what I'm arguing for is a program that would really, in some ways, increase the intensity of debate and increase the intensity of conflict to some degree. The conflict I want to be circumscribed by common convictions that we're brothers. But I think it's not. I think we're left in a state of immaturity because we don't really have to seriously confront differing opinions. So on a local level, what does that mean on a local level? Get a gathering of pastors to try to work through. You're not going to make a new confession of faith that every church in the world is going to adhere to, but get a group of pastors in a local area who can begin trying to work through their differences, praying together, humbly seeking the truth together, and being honest about their differences. This is not, and I think the effect could be one side wins and the other side loses. That could be an effect. What I'd want that to look like is that one side, the losing side, actually recognizes the truth of the winning side, that it's not really a winners and losers. That's not really the way it plays out, as both coming to sense. It could also be the fact that you have formulations of doctrine that actually go beyond differing opinions, that satisfy both sides, but actually are as yet unformulated positions. So I think those have to be confronted. I'm not arguing for a lowest common denominator kind of Catholicity. I'm certainly not arguing for ignoring theological differences. It would be absurd to think that we could unify without confronting that. But I think we have to confront it. Denominationalism keeps us from really doing that in a serious way.
Thank you, Doctor. David Carl. I believe the language you used was a commitment to liberal democracy is a commitment to denominationalism, something like that. Forgive me if I've got that inaccurate.
Yeah.
What that would seem to suggest is that a liberal democracy is antithetical to unity, but perhaps it's maybe just apathetic to unity. If the church were one, would the state care?
I think it would. Depends on how conspiracy. There are scholars of early American constitutional history. I say it as if there was a movement or a school. I know of a scholar. Okay, I concede. I know of one whose argument is, and I think this has some plausibility to it, that Madison's aim in setting up a disestablishment at the national level was precisely to ensure that no single sect, and you can find passages in Madison that say this, that no single sect was able to get inordinate power. I think the state has an interest in keeping the churches split and, kind of busy fighting each other. I think if you think about the difference between say a pastor of a local, maybe a large local church, talking to the mayor of Austin about some policy that he's adopted that he believes is morally evil. What's your constituency? You've got 1,000 people. I've got 100,000 people in other churches that support this policy. It's a very different situation when you have, let's say, a unified metropolitan church in Austin with spokesmen who can speak on behalf of Christians in general. That's a different scenario, and it is, I think would be a frightening thing for politicians to have to face that. It has much more potential to hit them where they live, which is votes.
Thank you. Marshall Jennings. I think you're right that when the last trumpet is sounded and we all come together and to meet Jesus in the air, that he'll take just one bride.
Yeah.
Somehow be one bride. But are there not, and I found this in my own life, I can go to a Catholic church and worship God, and I can go to a Presbyterian church or Lutheran, even a Church of Christ, of which I'm a member.
You can even worship there.
Yeah, I can. So it's an individual thing. So I subscribe to the higher principles that inform me from my meager studies of the New Testament: love, joy, peace, patience, brotherly kindness, all of those things that were taught by those early Christians, Paul, Peter, and others, that I think fill our hearts with a sense of brotherhood, and we become like an old man's, young men's Christian association in some sense. And we forget our differences based on our faith traditions, etc., or the fact that this guy is in a hierarchical group and his bishop is, doesn't talk to my little church member. You get my drift?
I think
maybe
so.
There's a higher sense of Christian principle that we can all share and enjoy.
Yeah. Let me address a couple things that you said. One is your point at the beginning about a final unity, one bride. I agree with that, and I also concede that any kind of unity that we achieve, a jagged, imperfect unity, that's in the nature of the case. That's true. But it does seem that the logic of the New Testament is, on the one hand, Paul's exhortations are often that take this form. This is true, therefore do what is true of you. You died to sin, therefore put sin to death. There's something that's the case now, and you're supposed to live in terms of that. Paul sometimes speaks instead in terms of a future orientation. Be what you will be. Live now in a way that anticipates what will fully be true in the eschaton. Romans 6, I've already alluded to just a moment ago, but Romans 6, I think the latter part of Romans 6 kind of operates on that premise. Paul says, you died to sin in baptism. You can walk in newness of life. Therefore, devote the members of your body to righteousness. That's your body participating in the resurrection now by devoting, when you devote your body to justice and righteousness, you're devoting it to something, you're living out of a resurrection that hasn't yet happened fully. It's happened in a sense, but it's still something that's to come. So and I think that that's true of the church as a body, that we're to live together in a way that anticipates the unity that we will have. So recognizing that we'll never have a final unity until we're in the new creation, that's still, I think, what the Bible encourages us to aspire to. The second point, I think, given the nature of the talk, it's about what I think is largely the tragedy of Christian division. But I don't want to disparage the kinds of unity and kinds of fellowship that we can have in any kind of church structure, and I fully agree with that. And there are various forms of unity of belief, various forms of unity in the Spirit that we experience in all kinds of different churches. And I didn't say that, but it's not because I think it's unimportant. I don't want to disparage those glimpses of unity at all.
Jim Mann, I kind of feel for your brother because I'm a Lutheran too. All right. In fact, I almost feel so much I think he's Missouri Synod like I am. I don't know if he is or not.
He is.
He is. Okay. All right. We could spot ourselves.
You don't even know him. Yes.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
One of the things that's interesting about the attitude, even within Missouri, is that sometimes we overlook some of the clauses, even within our own tradition, that talk about pastoral concerns beyond just our Lutheran group that makes Missouri Synod, such that if in certain situations I have somebody who is of the Reformed tradition that is dying in the hospital and wants communion, and there is no Reformed pastor that's going to be there or be able to be there, I would be allowed to share, at least from our Lutheran tradition, communion with him or prayer or whatever it is that might be the case that's going on. Of course, the battle in Missouri always is how pastoral can you be, all right, and that whole thing. Within your own parish, can you be hospitable to other denominations who come and visit on a Sunday versus, and how far that goes. So that'll probably be a long time battle. A lot of it comes under the rubric of what's called the felicitous inconsistency, and that is that, yes, our brothers beyond the Lutheran may be wrong about a lot of things, but they're right about Jesus and his salvation. And so that core saving belief allows a lot of pastoral versatility. How does that fit in with some of the things that you're pursuing as well as we come? I know it's going to have to deal more with the green on these other areas, but at least there's a core already, even in my Lutheran Missouri Synod perspective, that allows us to be more than just a denomination. Okay?
Yeah, and I affirm what you're saying. I think I like your phrase, felicitous inconsistency, which we all have. Just to address the point of that my brother brought up, that's a common, will be a common Lutheran objection. One of the things that the major personal experiences that got me thinking about these issues came during my doctoral studies. And I was working on Galatians 2, Paul's confrontation with Peter. And Paul says that Peter has undermined the gospel. Paul implies that he's in conflict with justification by faith. And what Peter has done is not denied any creedal statement. What Peter has done is withdrawn from table fellowship with Gentiles. So, and this, I think this is true in a number of different denominational systems that affirm, Protestant systems that affirm justification by faith on the other one hand, but in my mind, undermine it by table practices, by not recognizing other brothers as table companions, which seems to be Paul's point. If they're confessing Jesus, then they are your table companions, even if they're not keeping, in that case, if they're not keeping Torah. I have continued the debate with my brother on that, and he's still not, he's still being a staunch Lutheran. You'll be happy to know. But I think that's obviously going to one of those issues that has to be confronted and reconfronted, because it was one of the dividing issues at the Reformation.
My name is Rocky Bunkus. Question: if the liberal state makes it difficult to be a believer, to be a Christian, if they do proceed in this process, how would it change the way we see each other as far as someone who's willing to stand up and say, I love Jesus, when it's going to cost him something?
Yeah, I think that's, if I'm following the point, I think that's a very important part of the current situation, that we have churches that are beleaguered in various ways, and share that common sense of pressure and hostility from the world. You see this, Charles Colson talked about I think Charles Colson was the one who came up with the phrase, the ecumenism of the trenches, and he was referring to the pro-life movement and the involvement of evangelical Protestants and Catholics on street corners demonstrating, and they go to jail together as they're sitting in at abortion clinics, and they begin to suffer together, and that forms bonds that were not there before. And I think there's a biblical principle in there. I mentioned at the end of my talk that Ezekiel, I alluded to Ezekiel who talks about exile as a death. Exile is Israel going into the grave. And in the same passage that talks about the resurrection from the grave of exile, Ezekiel 37, also speaks about the Lord tying back together the stick of Judah and the stick of Israel. The divided tribes are going to be reunited, but they're reunited in the furnace of exile. It's going through that common experience of suffering that binds together. So I think if that's the direction you were going, I think that's a very important part of what we're experiencing today. And I think we, for various reasons, we need to. This is a gift from the Lord it's a challenge, but it's also a gift that we need to strive to be faithful to. The possibility for union that we didn't have before. Yes, sir.
My name is Martin Lutz. I have two questions. The first is, when you were talking about the biblical basis for the call to unity, it was curious to me that you didn't mention John's Gospel and the prayers of Jesus at the Last Supper, and I just wondered if there was some reason for that. And that unity would be very different from the denominationalism that we have now, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you think that unity would look like.
Yeah. On the John passage, that was not deliberate. That's in the book. I spend a lot of time talking about and referring to John 17. It's been a keystone of ecumenical Catholic movements for the last century. So I think that's, and maybe that goes to some way to answering the second question, because what Jesus prays for in John 17 is unity among disciples, but He, Father and the Son. And in that context, the unity that he describes is a unity of co-inhabitants, co-inherents. The Father is unified with the Son in that the Father is in the Son and the Son is in the Father. They have this shared life and dwell within each other. At least that should characterize disciples. We should inhabit one another's lives. Churches should inhabit one another's sufferings and trials, not close ourselves off from the sufferings and trials of other congregations. That's maybe a more abstract way to describe it. I'm thinking of, if you ask me what my dream situation would be, it would be at least something like this. Again, local church is where where something can be done by normal people. It's probably the easiest, it's the place where something can be done because you're actually dealing with face-to-face relationships and day-to-day kinds of relationships. So what would a unified local church look like? You'd still have multiple congregations. I think in the foreseeable future, you'd still have local congregations that have some identity with a denominational system. But those local congregations would have a self-identification as congregations of the Church of Austin, Texas. That their commitment is maybe to the denomination, but more centrally commitment to other churches locally. It would mean pastors and other leaders of the churches working together, praying together, studying together. It might mean that those pastors and leaders are able to come up with some kind of common confession that would be the confession of the Church of Austin, Texas. It would mean that churches would be communing together, that there would be intercommunion across all the different congregations within the city. It would mean that the city's church leaders could address civic leaders in a unified fashion on important moral and political questions, those that have real the kinds of things the church should address, issues of justice and morality. It would mean, I think also, I've advocated this for many years as kind of a baseline thing, that churches can share pastoral care. I know a lot of churches already do this, but to do it more self-consciously and more intentionally. By that I mean, if you have a member of your church who has some kind of serious pastoral struggle, somehow gets disaffected with the church and migrates to another church, make sure that the other pastor knows what he's getting. Make sure that the other pastor has some background. If you've disciplined somebody in your church, they are impenitently adhering to some sin and you've excommunicated them, they shouldn't be able to go down to the next block and go to another church. Discipline should be recognized across church boundaries. Those are the kinds of things that I'm envisioning. The higher level things would be things like a church having a local metropolitan church having a local metropolitan confession that all of the churches would adhere to, and being functionally united to such a degree that they could speak with a united voice to the world.
Time for one more question, I think.
If anybody here is Catholic or holds any of the sacraments I'm going to talk about, coming from a country where most people are Catholics from birth, they end up getting baptized as a baby. Most people hold a lot of idolatry, and I can say that when I got saved, it was a completely different reality. And so I have a vision where we have a relationship with God, and this is not emphasized in the Catholic Church, at least where I come from. It is not. Neither is the reading of the Bible emphasized, the importance of reading of the Bible and having a relationship with God. And idolatry is, as I understand, commanded from the Vatican to at least Mary. How do you envision all of us Protestants being able to overcome all of this with having such a huge. I think that's a huge stumbling block, Not only the baptism as a child, because the person didn't yet make a decision to follow Christ with the whole heart, but also the idolatry. And it seems like some of the Catholic churches in the country where I come from Brazil, they are trying to get reformed and get revival, but they can't get away with, they cannot not have at least Mary in their church, and they have to worship Mary.
Just for the sake of full disclosure, I baptize babies. All my children have been baptized as babies, so I share that with the Catholic Church. I agree with you. That's a huge issue. I recognize that the Catholic Church has a very different tenor and flavor in different parts of the world, and especially where it's dominant and has been dominant for a long time. It's very different from the kind of Catholicism that you generally encounter in the United States. One of the benefits of the denominational system that I described is that it churches like the Catholic and Orthodox churches have to adjust to American denominational order, and that does mean becoming somewhat more Protestant. But I agree that it's hard when I think about what would it take for the. Let me start by going back to what I said at the beginning. The premise of my book is to, or the plea of my book, part of it is to urge Protestants to be more Catholic in various ways, but also Catholics to be more Protestant. I'm addressing primarily Protestants because I'm a Protestant, and I don't know that Catholics have a lot of interest in hearing what I have to say about what they should do. But I think the Catholic Church still needs reformation by the Word of God. I think that the Catholic Church is in many respects, a different entity than it was 150 years ago. Vatican II was a massive shift, in some ways for ill, I think, and largely to the benefit of the Catholic Church. But I recognize that there are a lot of issues that need to be confronted. If I think about that, how do you address that kind of on purely human terms? I can't see that it's possible. I go back to what I was saying at the end of my talk. Jesus prays for unified, I'll say it here. Jesus prays for unified church. Jesus died to unite humanity. The Father is not going to ignore that prayer. He's not going to let the blood that Jesus shed go to waste. He is going to unify his church and unify the human race in his church, in Christ. How does that happen? I don't know, but I'm confident that God can do it. The other point I would make, again, going back to one of the problems of denominationalism is that it leaves us with the belief that we can treat those problems that you've identified in the Catholic Church as other people's problems. Those are the Catholic Church's problems, but not my problems as a Protestant. But Jesus is one. His church is still united in some way in him and by his Spirit. We all are members of the whole Church of Jesus Christ that includes Catholics who indulge in idolatry and Episcopalians who are practicing homosexuals. We are all part of that church. Denominationalism makes us feel like we can leave those to the side. They're not our problem. But I think that's a delusion. And part of the plea of my book is that we need to recognize that, and that means confronting those issues as our concerns, even if we're not in that particular denomination. Thank you.
Some concluding matters just before we dismiss here. There is a reception with light refreshments through the door here to the left. So everyone is welcome to go there, see some old friends, maybe make some new ones, and look for some of these things. We have a few books there, I think 3 books by Dr. Leithart for sale. Solomon among the postmoderns, Athanasius, and traces of the Trinity. We can take cash or check for those, and I'm sure Dr. Leithart would be willing to stick around and sign a purchased book. I hope you'll also stop by the other tables that we have in there. We have copies of the latest issue of First Things. If you do not subscribe to the magazine, feel free to take one of those with you and read while supplies last. We also have a display of some titles from Baker Publishing, and feel free to browse their catalog and take an order form from those books. We also have, I think, an advance galley proofs of the End of Protestantism. So don't take that one either, but you can look at it. We also have information about Austin Graduate School of Theology in there, so especially if this is your first exposure to our school, I hope you'll stop by that table and take some of that information. We have gratis copies of our faculty publication, Christian Studies, so feel free to take one of those. And we have some books for sale from Christian Studies Press. These are small books that I think of as sort of catechetical material. They're great for the use in churches, also in families. I think you'll find those useful. The latest one we have is a book on the Lord's Prayer, so please take a look at those. So I hope you'll join us for refreshments. Thank you for your presence tonight. And if you parked in the garage, you want to make sure you get your parking ticket validated. I think the machine is up here now in this foyer. So that's it. We're dismissed. Let us go in peace.